In this episode of Omec, we sit down with David Citron, the founding partner of TBD VC, an early stage fund built in the middle of the war with a mission to back first-time founders and veteran entrepreneurs. From a chance meeting at the Gaza border during reserve duty to launching a fund focused on startups born in crisis, David shares how his experience in venture and military service converged to shape a unique investment thesis. We talk about why Israel's pre-seed ecosystem is still underserved, what makes veterans powerful founders, and how TBD is building a global operator network to support the next generation of builders from day one. All right, David, let's start with your story. You were on reserve duty in Gaza when you met with Alan again, and that's where TBD got started. Tell me that story.
Yeah, for sure. So it's important to know that Alan and I have been friends for over a decade. It's been more of just like a personal relationship, not so much a business one. Alan's based in New York. We would see each other every now and then when I would come to the States. But I would say it was just like a long distance relationship, long distance friendship, nothing too intense. And as October 7th when it happened, I was drafted pretty much in the morning of the attack. And spent an overall of about 200 days in Gaza as a reservist. But during my first round of reserve duty from October 7th till about February, around December, I actually came out of the strip to escort a unit back into the strip. So typically you have to have some sort of like security forces that are bringing units in and out. It's just protocol. And I came out to escort a unit back in. And I remember sitting in my Hummer, sort of just waiting for the green light to go back in and get back into action. And one of my unit buddies walked up to me and said, "Hey, there's some American guy here. He's giving out free food and equipment to soldiers. Maybe you can go talk to him, and maybe get a donation for the unit." So being the resident American and English speaker in the unit, that was my job. So reluctantly walked over and then bumped into Alan. It was a very surreal experience, especially given the fact that most of my life was on total hold during my reserve period, and I was just full soldier mode. So seeing somebody from my personal life from such a distant part of my personal life was pretty remarkable. So it kind of like rekindled the relationship in a much more intense way, and it got us talking. And Alan went back to the States after spending a couple months in Israel, fundraising and donating equipment to soldiers. I was going in and out of Gaza, but every time I was out, I would either go to the States, to New York, he would come to Israel, and we'd spend a lot more time together, eventually leading up to us deciding to join forces at the end of 2024 and raising our fund in the beginning of 2025.
So starting a fund during a war, some people would say it's crazy, but I think someone like you would say that the timing is perfect. How does the timing and everything going on in Israel affect the DNA of the fund?
So I think, crazy is relative, especially in Israel. We have a tendency of normalizing the not normal in Israel, and it makes us thrive. So the notion of starting a venture capital fund in and of itself is challenging, especially given the fact that the markets somewhat corrected themselves after a pretty intense bull run in 2021 and 2022. And the thought of raising a fund is challenging irregardless. But if you couple that with just the specific circumstances that Israel was experiencing, I think it definitely seems challenging from the outside. Having said that, when you compare it to your experience as a reservist and the things that you see, especially given this very intense war that's been going on for nearly 2 years, everything else seems like a piece of cake, right? Pitching investors and finding investment opportunities and building a business in general, comparatively, is not that daunting. I will say that it kind of creates a different type of mentality when it comes to success or winning, right? I think before the war, David Citron before the war would take things very, very seriously. If I would lose a deal, it would be the end of the world. If I wouldn't be able to secure an investor that I've been talking to for a couple of months, it'd be the end of the world. I think the perspective that the war has given me makes me take things in a much lighter way, not to the point where, apathy, but rather understanding that there's a greater goal, and the greater goal is investing in incredible technology companies and helping the Israeli economy and rebuilding after such a terrible tragedy that has really derailed a lot of the country's energy in a positive way, but also in a very negative way. So being able to contribute to that, it was the main driver for me. So when we look at like how we do things internally, it's, no matter how many times you get knocked down, you just get up again, which sounds very cliche, but that's what it's all about.
TBD is focusing on first-time founders in pre-seed. Why pre-seed? And what kind of founders and companies are you investing into?
Sure. Pre-seed is a category that I'm personally very passionate about. It is probably the stage of the company that has the highest level of ambiguity and the lowest level of resources. If you compare pre-seed to seed, they're virtually the same thing. It's the same starting point. It's a team that has an idea at best, and they're raising a certain amount of capital. In pre-seed, they just raise a lot less. So from my perspective, the chaos is where you can really create a lot of beauty. And that's why I really resonate on a personal level with pre-seed. I think specifically in Israel, looking at the ecosystem has gone through cycles over the past decade, at least, my 13-year career for sure. And many of the funds have evolved to become predominantly seed focused funds. Some of them maybe even Series A, but they're a lot larger, bigger check writers. And what happened was, is as time went by and they became more and more focused on doing seed, there was an underserved sort of pocket in the early stage deal flow, which was pre-seed, where most of the funds in Israel don't or can't or won't write smaller checks, $1 million checks. And in contrary to the US, you don't have many super angels that can do $500,000 to $1 million checks in companies. They exist, but infrequently. So it creates a really interesting gap. Now, looking at the sort of persona that you mentioned, first time founders. The reason why I like working with first time founders is because number one, they're coachable. And sometimes second time founders have a very specific way of doing things for good and for bad. Number two, you have the ability to compete. What we're seeing now with second time founders that are building monumental companies is that all the big investors, Sequoia Index, are here and they're going all after, that type of category. It leaves a lot of vacancy in a very, very talented pool of human capital that is building companies. So from my perspective, I don't view it as like going after a less sought after category, but rather taking an opportunity to really capitalize on what nobody's really focusing on. So kind of, going zig when everyone else is going zag. And that's essentially it. And I think, talked about, the hustle and like there's no falling back and you can't really take no for an answer. That's what first time entrepreneurs are, because they don't have their cushy sort of previous exit to fall back on. For them, it's like do or die. And I really resonate with that sort of mentality.
You backed some pretty big winners before, Flow Security and Voca. How did you catch on to those companies? And are you seeing any resemblance in the characteristics of the companies you are backing today?
So it's very interesting because, they're two great outcomes and two phenomenal companies. Very different process, at least, as how I remember it. Voca was very thesis driven. When I invested in the company, it was very focused on voice technology, believing that with the technology that existed back then, which is totally archaic in comparison to what we're seeing today, which is, incredible, they were doing some amazing things with synthetic voice generation and its business application. So for me, I was really looking at that industry and kind of like circling back. So it wasn't a founder first approach, but rather an industry first approach. The challenge there is like you can fall in love with an industry and potentially back the wrong founder. Specifically here, it was a serial entrepreneur. He already sold a business to eBay. He was a phenomenal executor, and he did really, really, really well. So sort of like, meshing the thesis-driven sort of discovery process with a really, really solid founder was a no-brainer. And I was very passionate about that deal. That was something that I was really excited about. I still remember the investment memo that I wrote on that one. And it ended up being a really, really good outcome. Flow Security, on the other hand, was 1000% a team bet. I remember getting connected to the founders during COVID, actually. And it's really interesting because I reached out to the CEO initially, cold outreach on LinkedIn, and he did not want to talk to me. But I don't take no for an answer. So I just found, went through his LinkedIn connections and tried to figure out who can make the connection and vouch for me. And I found somebody that was willing to do that. And being able to kind of, connect with him and resonate and understand that this is a person that was really going to stop at nothing to succeed. Despite the category having competitors and quite big ones at the time. So for me, it wasn't so much the industry, rather the pure founder bet there. So Johnny and Ram, absolutely incredible entrepreneurs. tenacious, even when times were tough, and there were tough times, and they were eventually able to really get out a really big win during the war, getting acquired by CrowdStrike for, up to $200 million during the worst war in our country's history is something that is phenomenal. And I'm very, very, very fortunate to have been a small part of it.
I have a quote from you saying, Israel is the best place to find technical founders, but the next generation is global. What do you mean by that?
The technology that exists in Israel is deeply rooted in the military, right? The military is a problem solver on steroids. We're solving life and death problems all the time, and the ability to use that as a playing ground for the cutting edge technology is incredible because you don't have a choice, right? You have to leverage all the tools that you can and be innovative and daring, and create solutions that actually solve the problem. And I think that's a big driver when it comes to creating, iconic companies. And that's why Israelis are so great in comparison to anywhere around the world. And I think, a lot of ecosystems trying to replicate the Israeli ecosystem can try, but it's artificial and it's limited to a very, very low extent. When it comes to like globality, I think there was a trend. I remember when I started my career that after the Series A, the CEO would relocate to the States. They'd have like a sales and marketing office in the States. R&D would be in Israel. And that worked. And I think if you look at like the really iconic companies around the world, they're primarily happening in the US. And the difference between a really solid Israeli outcome and a phenomenal company, in my view and based on my experience, is how quickly they can set up that establishment or set up that presence in the US. Because being able to sit in the same room with your customer or being able to kind of be down the street from the best investors in the world when it comes to follow-on capital and physically being there is a fundamental game changer. And I think we learned that the hard way in the past 2 years. Not being able to get on a flight out of Israel, it was something very real. So when I'm talking about it, founders being global, I really purely mean that the captain of the company will be physically outside of Israel, but the brains will still be here, the R&D will still be here, and the talent will still be in Israel.
You've made it your personal mission to support combat veterans breaking into tech. What is it that they bring to the table as founders of companies?
So I think it's a combination of not just what they bring, but what I think they deserve. And I'm an outlier. I'm a former combat vet who managed to weasel his way into the tech ecosystem. And the vast majority of VCs and just entrepreneurs in general do not come from combat. They do exist. We're here. There are dozens of us, but we're outnumbered quite dramatically. And there are a variety of reasons. Whether it's being able to have access to certain skill sets and schools during your military service versus doing different things that are not very applicable for your civilian life. But at the end of the day, I've always thought that, if you go to combat, you're doing it from a pure idealistic perspective. Whereas when you go to a tech unit, you're doing it from an idealistic perspective because there are ways to not serve, but you're also getting an added bonus that when you get discharged, you could probably get a job at Google. So, taking the real dedication and sometimes the ultimate sacrifice from a mental and physical perspective that combat vets have to pay, and finding a way to sort of reward that is paramount, especially for me, and especially after the 2 years, seeing so many folks on reserves and on their mandatory service as combat vets, not just, but a lot. I serve with combat folks, doing whatever they need to do and leaving their families behind and going for the 6th round, 7th round of reserve duty. So being able to do that again and again and again, it justifies something in return. I think it's not just charity. It's not just being benevolent to the combat vets. There's something to be said of somebody who can keep their cool under fire, literal fire. Being shot at a few times, put things into perspective. I mentioned that in the beginning of this session. So I think if you take these folks who are real, like got the can-do attitude and don't get really phased by too much, especially because everything's really mild within perspective, it makes them incredible executors. They execute really well, and that's what a startup needs to do, especially at the early stage. So being able to bring that real, raw mentality to the startup ecosystem is incredible, and it should happen more often than not.
Looking ahead, 5 years, 10 years, what do you see for TBD and for Israel as a whole?
I wish I could answer that. If you would have asked me 2 years ago if I thought we'd be sitting here and, discussing this within the context of the past years, I'd say no way. So it's hard to say. I will say that despite the crazy past 2 years, Israel has not only remained resilient from a tech perspective, but they've thrived. So I'm certain that this is just the beginning of the next golden age for the Israeli tech ecosystem. I'm certain we're going to see many more multi-billion-dollar outcomes coming out of Israel, not just in cybersecurity, but in other domains. And I'm incredibly bullish. With regards to TBD, for us, we want to stay small, lean, and nimble forever. Always focus on the pre-seed, always be first checks. We don't want to find ourselves becoming what we're calling a challenge on now, bigger funds who write bigger checks who are slower. So, stick in our lane, be an expert in one specific thing versus trying to do a bunch of different things at once.
That's all for this episode. Make sure to subscribe for the next.